Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight we're going to follow one man across the entire breadth of the 11th century world, from a hillside in Norway where he was wounded as a 15-year-old boy fighting for his half-brother's throne, to the rivers of Kievan Rus where he served a prince and fell in love with a princess who wouldn't have him yet, to Constantinople, the greatest city in the world, where he spent a decade doing the most dangerous work the Byzantine Empire had to offer, fighting in Sicily and Bulgaria and along the Euphrates, accumulating gold and scars and a reputation that crossed language barriers, until he came home to Norway with more wealth than anyone in the north had seen from a single source, took a throne, fought a 20-year war for another one, and then, at 50 years old, sailed down on England with 300 ships because a complicated succession argument and an exiled Englishman had convinced him the throne of England was his for the taking. His name was Harald Sigurdsson. History knows him as Harald Hardrada. Hardradi in the Old Norse, meaning hard ruler, or stern counsel, or simply the difficult one, depending on which nuance of the word you lean on. The epithet came from his contemporaries and it stuck. He was the kind of man who generates epithets. Adam of Bremen, the 11th century German chronicler, who had good reason to know what the Vikings had been capable of at their most formidable, called him the Thunderbolt of the North. The sagas, which are always somewhat romantic about their subjects but sometimes get the essential character right, describe a man of prodigious physical size and strength, of tactical cunning matched with personal recklessness, of enormous ambition and the specific ruthlessness that enormous ambition in the Viking age required. He is often called the last great Viking, which is a label that historians are professionally skeptical of. Last and greatest claims tend to be overworked, but in Harald's case it carries genuine meaning. He was the last man to attempt the conquest of England as a Viking enterprise, and his failure at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, is one of the dates that marks the passing of a world. That is the ending. The beginning is very different. The beginning is a wounded boy fleeing across a dark forest in Norway after watching his brother die, and everything that comes between those two moments is one of the most extraordinary single lives in the medieval record. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for, and as always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. The image of this drifting over different continents simultaneously is one I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights. Let the room go soft. You have nowhere to be. And let us go north, to the Norway of 1030, to a battlefield in Trøndelag, to the moment that made Harald Hardrada who he was. Norway in the early 11th century was a country in the process of becoming itself, and the process was violent. But before we can understand the specific violence of Harald's world, we need to understand the world itself, the specific texture of Norse civilization at the moment it was producing its last great exemplar. The Norse world of the early 11th century was not the romanticized world of dragons and horned helmets that popular culture has constructed from its fragments. It was a complex, sophisticated, and in many ways progressive society that had developed along lines significantly different from the feudal organization of Western Europe. Norse society was organized around the farm rather than the castle. The basic unit was the independent farmer, the bondi, who owned his land, owed military service to the king, participated in the local thing assembly, where law was made and disputes settled, and expected to be treated with a basic dignity that the feudal serfdom of France or England would not have extended to a man of equivalent economic position. The Norse legal tradition was unusually developed, transmitted orally by specialists, the law speakers, and enforced through the thing system in ways that gave ordinary free men more access to legal remedy than most contemporary European societies provided. The sagas that preserve Harald's story and the stories of his predecessors were not written until the 13th century, but they drew on an oral tradition of remarkable depth and fidelity, transmitted through the specific Norse institution of the skald, the court poet whose function was to compose and preserve in verse the deeds of the kings and warriors he served. Skaldic verse was technically demanding to a degree that made it simultaneously a form of art and a form of memorization technology. The complex metrical patterns, the system of kennings, metaphorical compound expressions in which, for example, the sea was the whale road and gold was the fire of the sea, created texts that were very difficult to alter in transmission, because the meter and the kenning pattern were so specific that changes would be immediately apparent to anyone who knew the form. The skalds who praised Harald's victories in Sicily or his campaigns against Denmark were producing, in their elaborate verse, something closer to contemporary reporting than to pure literary invention, and the fragments of their work that survive embedded in the later prose sagas provide the closest thing the period has to eyewitness testimony. Harald himself composed poetry. The sagas record examples of his verse at several points in his career, and whether the specific poems attributed to him are genuinely his or later inventions placed in his mouth, the cultural fact that a Viking king was expected to compose poetry, that martial prowess and lyric skill were understood as facets of the same complete person, tells you something important about the Norse world he inhabited. He was not merely a warrior. He was a warrior poet in the specific Norse tradition, and the tradition took the poet half of that equation seriously. Norway in the early 11th century was a country in the process of becoming itself, and the process was violent. The Scandinavian world in this period was not the stable collection of nation-states that the modern map suggests. It was a fluid and contested political landscape in which kings and jarls, the great chieftains who wielded regional authority, competed for dominance through a combination of military force, dynastic marriage, political alliance, and the specific kind of personal charisma that the Norse world valued in its leaders and called something like drengskap, the quality of the good man, the man worth following. Borders were not fixed lines on a map. They were the outward expression of the current balance of military and political power, and they shifted with every battle, every death, every advantageous marriage. The power that had most recently reshaped the Norwegian political landscape was Danish. Canute the Great, Canute in Danish, Canute in the anglicised version that English language history has settled on, was one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe in the early 11th century. He had conquered England in 1016, consolidating his hold over it, and then turning his attention to Scandinavia, building what historians sometimes call the North Sea Empire, a political entity that at its height encompassed England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, held together by a combination of military force and Knut's exceptional political skill at managing the competing interests of very different populations. In 1028, Knut had driven Harald's elder half-brother Olaf Haraldsson off the Norwegian throne and installed his own people as administrators of Norway, reducing it from an independent kingdom to a Danish dependency. Olaf Haraldsson was, by the time of his deposition, already on his way to becoming a figure much larger than a political king. He had been working systematically to Christianize Norway, not merely in the nominal sense of declaring it Christian, but in the determined sense of destroying the old shrines and forcing baptism on communities that had been practicing Norse religion for generations, sometimes at the point of a sword. This combination of genuine Christian conviction and brutal methods was characteristic of how the Christianization of Scandinavia actually worked, and the resistance it generated was substantial enough to make Knut's deposition of Olaf politically viable. He had enemies in Norway who welcomed the Danish invasion as an opportunity to be rid of a king whose religious program was unpopular with exactly the regional chieftains whose cooperation he needed to govern. Olaf went into exile in Kievan Rus, to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Novgorod, a refuge that would become important for Harald as well. He returned in 1030 with a small army gathered from Swedish allies and the Norse exiles who had followed him into exile. Determined to reclaim his throne, he brought his 15-year-old half-brother Harald. The meaning of Olaf's death at Stiklestad would grow into something that neither side at the battle could have anticipated. Within a year of his death, Olaf Haraldsson was being called a martyr. Within 2 years, he was being called a saint. The specific mechanism of his canonization was informal by later standards. The formal papal process for recognizing sainthood was still being developed, and in the 11th century North, sanctity was recognized through popular cult and episcopal confirmation, rather than through Rome's direct involvement. Miracles were reported at Olaf's tomb. His body was found incorrupt when exhumed, which was taken as the definitive sign of holiness. He was declared a saint by the Bishop of Nidaros in 1031. This same year his body was enshrined in the church that would eventually become the great cathedral of Trondheim. The cult of St. Olaf transformed the political meaning of his death in ways that complicated Harald's entire subsequent career. Olaf had been deposed by a coalition of Norwegian chieftains backed by Danish power, and he had been killed at Stiklestad fighting to retake a throne that those chieftains did not want him to have. But the cult of St. Olaf reframed all of this. The king who had been overthrown by his own people became the martyr who died for Norway and for Christianity. And the people who had opposed him, including the Danish power that Knut represented, became the agents of the saint's martyrdom, retroactively positioned on the wrong side of history. This reframing had real political consequences, because it meant that the Norwegian royal house that Olaf had established was now a dynasty under divine protection, and any claim to the Norwegian throne that did not connect to Olaf's line was politically vulnerable. Harald was Olaf's half-brother, which gave him a connection to the saintly king that was genuine rather than merely invented. But it also meant that everything Harald did was measured against the standard of a man who had become, in death, the patron saint of Norway, a standard of sanctified heroism that a warrior mercenary who had spent a decade making money for the Byzantine Empire could not easily match. The ambivalence of Harald's relationship to his dead brother's reputation runs through the saga tradition. He was Olaf's kinsman, and the avenger of Olaf's cause in the sense that he would eventually restore the Norwegian throne to their family. But he was also recognizably different from Olaf in character, harder, more pragmatic, less invested in the religious mission that had made Olaf both difficult to govern with and easy to worship after death. Harald was what you got when you took the blood without the sanctity. He returned in 1030 with a small army gathered from Swedish allies and the Norse exiles who had followed him into exile the Battle of Stiklestad. Fought on July 29th, 1030, was the attempt by Olaf to force his way back onto the Norwegian throne, and it failed comprehensively. The force that met him was larger than his. Some accounts give the defenders something in the range of 14,000 men against Olaf's 6,000 or 7,000, and was composed partly of Norwegian farmers and chieftains who had specific grievances against Olaf's religious coercion and partly of men loyal to the Danish-backed interests that had prospered during Olaf's exile. The battle was bloody and went against Olaf from early in the fighting. He was killed. The 15-year-old Harald was wounded, badly enough that he needed to be carried off the field and hidden in the forest, but not so badly that he died. The specific wounds Harald received at Stiklestad are recorded vaguely in the sources. The sagas describe him as seriously injured and unable to fight or ride, which suggest wounds significant enough to require extended recovery. He was carried to safety by some of the men who had fought with him, sheltered in a remote farmhouse in eastern Norway while he healed over the course of weeks, and then, as his condition improved enough to travel, moved north and east towards Sweden and eventually toward the country the Norse called Gardariki, the realm of strongholds, the network of Norse-founded trading cities along the rivers of what is now western Russia, centered on Novgorod and Kiev, which we call Kievan Rus. He was 15 years old, wounded, far from home, with no throne, no wealth beyond what he could carry, and no obvious future. The person he would become in the next 15 years would be built entirely from what he could make of himself, in places that had no reason to care about his origins except as raw material. The world Harald entered when he crossed into Kievan Rus was genuinely cosmopolitan, in ways that are easy to forget when we think about the 11th century. But it is worth pausing on Kievan Rus itself because it was a genuinely remarkable civilization, and one whose Norse connections were fundamental to its character. Kievan Rus, the network of city-states and principalities centered on Kiev, Novgorod, and the river systems connecting them, had been founded in the Norse origin tradition by the Varangians. The Rus Primary Chronicle, the foundational text of Kievan Rus history, compiled in the early 12th century, preserves a tradition that the Slavic peoples of the region had invited the Varangian leader Rurik to come and rule them, because their local governance was insufficient. They could not govern themselves, so they sent for men from across the sea. The historical reality was certainly more complex. The Norse presence in the region was the result of trading expeditions and settlement rather than a single founding act. But the tradition captures something real about the relationship between the Norse trading networks of the Baltic and the river cities of the east. The Rus trade routes along the Dnieper and the Volga, connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium and to the Islamic world of the Caspian Basin, had been the commercial arteries of the Viking Age's eastern dimension for generations before Harald's time. By Yaroslav's day, he ruled as Grand Prince of Kiev from 1019 to 1054, the Rus Principality was a Christian state, having been baptized under Vladimir in 988, in the same ceremony that had led to the establishment of the Varangian Guard, when Vladimir sent 6,000 warriors to Basilland. It was culturally and linguistically Slavic in its common population, but Norse in many of its aristocratic traditions, and the court at Kiev was specifically connected to Scandinavia through the continuous flow of Norse warriors seeking service, Norse merchants seeking trade, and the dynastic marriages that Yaroslav cultivated so carefully. Harald was not an unusual visitor at Yaroslav's court. He was one of a steady stream of Norse exiles, adventurers, and younger sons who found their way east along the river routes and were absorbed into the Rus military and commercial establishment. What Yaroslav provided for Harald was not charity but opportunity, and specifically the opportunity to develop in a setting that valued military expertise and rewarded it materially, the leadership skills and the military reputation that he would need if he was ever going to be more than a well-connected exile. The campaigns Harald participated in under Yaroslav's command, against the Poles, against the Baltic peoples, against the Pechenegs, were Harald's first substantial experience of commanding men in the field. and they were conducted in an environment where the political and logistical dimensions of campaigning were as important as the tactical ones. He was learning to be a commander, not just a warrior, and the distinction mattered. Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev, who'd consolidated his control over the Rus principalities through a combination of military victory, diplomatic marriage, and administrative development that earned him the epithet history has attached, was one of the most extensively connected rulers in Christendom. His daughters would marry the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway. His sons married into the dynasties of Poland, Germany, and Byzantium. His court at Kiev was a crossroads of European dynastic politics, a place where you might encounter ambassadors and missionaries and merchants from every direction simultaneously. Yaroslav had personal connections to Norway through his relationship with Olaf Haraldsson. Olaf had spent time at Yaroslav's court during his earlier exile, before his 1030 return and death, and the arrival of Olaf's surviving half-brother was therefore not the arrival of an unknown quantity, but the arrival of a young man with a recognizable identity and a connection to someone Yaroslav had known and respected. Harald was welcomed. He was given a position in Yaroslav's forces and spent several years, these sources suggest between 2 and 4, serving as a military commander in the Grand Prince's army. The campaigns Harald participated in under Yaroslav's authority were not small frontier skirmishes. They included operations against the Poles in the west, against the Teudes, the Baltic peoples in what is now Estonia, in the north, and against the Pechenegs, the steppe nomads who pressed on the southern and eastern frontiers of the Rus territories with a persistence that required continuous military response. These were real wars, fought in difficult terrain against capable opponents, and the experience they gave Harald, commanding men in the field, managing the logistics of campaigning across large distances, learning to fight in the fluid, mobile style that steppe warfare required, as well as in the close order formations that Norse warriors preferred, was laying the foundation for the extraordinary military career that was coming. He also fell in love, or conceived an ambition that in the saga literature expresses itself through the language of love. Yaroslav had a daughter named Elizabeth in the Slavic rendering, and Harald wanted to marry her. He was told, by whatever mechanism these things were communicated, that he had not yet done enough to deserve her. The sagas present this as Yaroslav's specific refusal, which may or may not be accurate in its specifics, but the emotional structure of the story, Harald driven by the desire to accumulate sufficient renown and wealth to be worthy of the woman he wanted, provides the saga's explanation for the next phase of his life. Whether or not the love story is told accurately, the ambition it represents is plausible. Harald was the younger half-brother of a dead king, an exile without resources, in a court where his worth was measured by what he could do. He needed to do something big. He went to Constantinople. The journey from Kiev to Constantinople was not unusual for ambitious young Norsemen of the period. The route south along the Dnieper River and across the Black Sea was a well-established commercial and military pathway, the same route that had been bringing Viking traders and warriors to Byzantium for generations. Constantinople was the destination of men who wanted wealth, military employment, and the specific kind of experience that the Byzantine Empire, which was fighting wars on multiple frontiers simultaneously and was perpetually in need of tough professional soldiers, could provide. The Varangian Guard had been established in 988 when the Byzantine Emperor River Derwent, facing a political crisis, had requested and received from the Rus Prince Vladimir a force of 6,000 Varangian warriors, who became the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. By the time Harald arrived in 1034, the Guard had been an established institution for nearly 50 years, with its own traditions, its own prestige, and its own specific position in the Byzantine military hierarchy. Constantinople in 1034 was the largest city in the Christian world, a city of perhaps 400,000 people, extraordinary by the standards of an age when most European cities were small market towns, built on the peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, protected on the land side by the massive Theodosian walls that had kept it inviolate for centuries and would keep it inviolate for another 400 years. The city that Harald entered was the centre of what called itself the Roman Empire, not Roman in the cultural sense that Rome itself was Roman, but Roman in the institutional and legal and ideological sense, the direct continuator of the Roman imperial tradition, governed by an emperor who held the titles and performed the ceremonies that the Caesars had established 1,000 years earlier, operating within a legal system that traced itself directly to Justinian's great codification of Roman law. The Byzantines were not nostalgic about Rome, they were Rome in their own self-understanding, and the rest of the world was, by definition, less organised. The contrast between the world Harald had come from, the longhouses and mead halls and open-air thing of Scandinavia, the wooden palisades of the Rus cities, the wind-driven longships of the North Sea, and the world he found himself in must have been startling in ways that even the most well-travelled Norse warrior would have found genuinely striking. But it is worth dwelling on Constantinople specifically, because it appears to have made a permanent impression on Harald, and because the traces of that impression show up in what he built and tried to build afterward. The Byzantine capital was the repository of the accumulated material and intellectual culture of the Roman world, a civilization that has been accumulating wealth and refinement and institutional complexity for 1,000 years, without the interruption that the fall of the Western Empire had imposed on the rest of the Mediterranean world. Walking through Constantinople in the 1030s, you would have walked past the Hippodrome, the great chariot racing stadium that was also the city's central public gathering place, decorated with bronze statues looted from the ancient world, where political celebrations and executions were conducted with equal ceremony, and past the Hagia Sophia, whose dome, catching the light that filtered through its ring of windows, created the effect that Procopius had described 5 centuries earlier as the dome suspended from heaven by a golden chain, an effect that had not diminished in 500 years of continuous use. You would have walked through the Forum of Constantine with its porphyry column and its statue of the first Christian emperor on top, and through the great commercial streets of the Mese, the Middle Way, where the shops of artisans and merchants and money changers occupied carefully regulated spaces in an urban economy of a sophistication that no northern European city of the period came close to matching. The imperial palace complex occupied the southeastern tip of the peninsula, and it was inside this complex that Harald would have spent much of his time in Constantinople, because the Varangian Guard's primary function was the physical protection of the emperor, which meant close proximity to the most elaborately ceremonial court in Christendom. The Book of Ceremonies, compiled by the Emperor Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitos in the previous century, ran to hundreds of pages specifying the exact ritual and spatial arrangements for every event in the imperial calendar, every procession, every banquet, every greeting of ambassadors, every appointment of officials, every religious service in the palace chapel. And the guard's role in these ceremonies was specified with the same care as everything else. Harald learned in the Byzantine court a style of imperial authority that was as far from the Norse king's relationship with his warriors as it was possible to get. The Byzantine emperor was the terrestrial representative of God's order, surrounded by ritual and hierarchy that mediated between his sacred person and ordinary human contact. What Harald took from this is, as always with him, filtered through the sagas and difficult to assess precisely. But the coin economy he instituted in Norway when he became king, something no previous Norwegian king had done to the same degree. The systematic administrative organisation he imposed on the Norwegian territories, the construction projects he pursued in Trondheim. These suggest a man who had absorbed something of Byzantine state-building in addition to Byzantine military technique. He was not trying to recreate Constantinople in Norway, but he had learned from the most sophisticated state in the Christian world what sophisticated state administration looked like, and he brought that knowledge home. The Byzantine empresses who appear in the saga tradition of Harald's Constantinople years are, in the sources, both more and less than they appear. The story that Empress Zoe, the aging but still politically formidable daughter of Constantine the Wise, who had been married to a series of emperors, and who was the formal linchpin of the Macedonian dynasty's legitimacy, had designs on the young Norse commander, is almost certainly more legend than fact. But the sagas clearly find the idea of the Empress and the Viking irresistible, and invest it with a narrative energy that says something about how the Norse tradition processed its memory of the Byzantine world as a place of extraordinary wealth and sophistication, slightly decadent, female in its court intrigue, against which the Norse warrior's masculine directness stood in flattering contrast. The reality was more complex. Zoe was a genuine political operator in a court where political operation was both necessary and extremely dangerous, and the Varangians' role in the political events of 1042 was real, even if the romance was not. The palaces of Constantinople were built of marble and decorated with gold mosaic. The churches, above all the Hagia Sophia, which Justinian had completed in 537, and which was still, 5 centuries later, the largest domed interior in the world, were architectural experiences of a kind that had no equivalent in the north. The commercial and administrative life of the city was supported by a bureaucracy and a legal system of bewildering complexity, operating in Greek that was the institutional language of everything, but that sat alongside Latin ceremonial and Slavic commercial contacts and Arabic diplomatic correspondence in a linguistic world that was itself an expression of the empire's reach. Harald arrived with approximately 500 men. He must have understood immediately that he was in a different world entirely, and the saga suggests that his response was characteristic. He paid attention, he adapted, and he made himself useful. The Varangian Guard that Harald joined was, by 1034, an institution of nearly 50 years standing with its own traditions, prestige, and internal culture. But the Guard itself deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts of Harald's career, because it was a genuinely remarkable institution, a permanent core of Norse mercenaries at the heart of the most powerful Christian state in the world, maintaining a distinct cultural and ethnic identity within the Byzantine military establishment for 2 centuries. The Guard's founding in 988 was the product of a specific political crisis. The Emperor Basil VII, confronted by a serious military revolt, had negotiated with the Rus Prince Vladimir for military assistance, and the 6,000 Varangians that Vladimir sent were the price of a political alliance cemented by Vladimir's marriage to Basil's sister. The Varangians' performance in suppressing the revolt was effective enough that Basil retained them as a permanent core, and the decision proved durable enough to outlast him and every subsequent emperor for 200 years. The Guard's specific usefulness to the Byzantine court was partly military. They were genuinely excellent soldiers, but partly political. Their foreignness was an asset. They had no local loyalties, no family connections to Byzantine aristocratic factions, no personal stake in the endless competition of Byzantine court politics. They owed their position entirely to imperial favour, and their loyalty ran to the person who paid them, which in the system's design was the emperor. The specific culture that the Guard developed reflected this position. They drank heavily. Byzantine sources note this with a combination of distaste and affection. They maintained Norse customs in their off-duty hours. They celebrated Norse festivals alongside Byzantine Christian ones, and they fought with the weapons and in the style of their homelands. The double-handed axe that became the Guard's signature weapon in Byzantine accounts, and in the artistic representations that survive, was not a Byzantine weapon tradition. It was Norse, imported by men who'd been using it since childhood, and who trusted it in a way they did not trust the Byzantine Spathyon sword. The Guard was, in this sense, a fragment of the Norse world transplanted intact into the centre of the Byzantine world and maintained there because its difference was part of what made it valuable. For young Norse warriors of the 11th century, service in the Guard was simultaneously the most prestigious employment available and the best school of professional military experience anywhere in the world. The Byzantine army of the early 11th century was fighting on multiple frontiers against the Fatimid Caliphate in Syria, against the Seljuk Turks pressing from the east, against various Balkan powers, against Arab pirates in the Aegean, against the normal range of threats that an empire of its size and position maintained on continuous watch for. Varangian guardsmen participated in all of these conflicts, acquiring a breadth of military experience that no single Norse war could have provided. They learned siege warfare and naval combat and cavalry support and mountain campaigning. They acquired military vocabulary from a dozen languages and tactical knowledge from commanders who drew on a millennium of Roman and Byzantine military tradition. When they came home, and many did come home, carrying their accumulated gold and their broadened experience, they came home transformed by what they had seen and done. Harald came home more transformed than most. The Varangian Guard that Harald joined was, by 1034, primarily composed of Norsemen from Scandinavia and the Rus territories, though it also included Anglo-Saxons and other northern Europeans, a multilingual, multicultural force whose shared characteristic was professional military excellence, and whose loyalty to the Byzantine emperor was maintained partly through the enormous pay and benefits the Guard received, and partly through the specific cultural identity of being the emperor's personal guard, which carried prestige that no amount of money alone could have generated. The Guard fought with the two-handed Danish axe, the lebris, that became its identifying weapon in Byzantine sources and that required a specific fighting style. Powerful, aggressive, effective at close range and devastating in formed battle, but requiring the kind of physical strength and trained coordination that the Guard's continuous practice maintained. Harald's rise within the Guard was rapid, and the sagas attribute it partly to his personal qualities, his size, his strength, his tactical intelligence, his ability to lead men in the specific chaos of 11th century warfare, and partly to the wealth he had already accumulated, which allowed him to equip and pay the men who followed him with a generosity that bought loyalty. He was not merely another Guard member. He arrived as a man who brought followers of his own, which immediately positioned him as a unit commander rather than an ordinary soldier, and his subsequent military record gave him the standing to maintain and expand that position. The campaigns he fought under Byzantine command across the decade from roughly 1034 to 1042 covered an astonishing geographic range. He served in operations along the Asia Minor coast against Arab pirates, who had been disrupting Byzantine maritime commerce in the Aegean. naval operations that required the kind of amphibious flexibility that combined Norse seamanship with Byzantine tactical organization. He participated in operations along the Euphrates frontier against the Arab powers pressing on the empire's eastern borders. The sources mention the capture of 80 strongholds along the river, which is probably an exaggeration of the saga tradition, but reflects genuine sustained military activity in the region. He fought in Bulgaria, where a major revolt against Byzantine authority in 1040 required substantial military resources to suppress, and where Harald's Varangians provided some of the most effective close combat infantry available to the Byzantine commanders, and he campaigned in Sicily. The Sicilian campaign of 1038 to 1041 was the largest and most ambitious Byzantine military operation of the period, a genuine attempt to reconquer the island from the Arab emirs who'd held it since the 9th century. The Byzantine commander was George Maniacs, one of the most formidable military figures of the 11th century, described by the sources as physically enormous, with a voice like thunder and a manner that his own officers found terrifying, and the force he commanded was a genuinely multinational army that included, alongside the Byzantine regulars and the Varangians, Norman mercenaries from southern Italy. Among those Normans was a man named William de Hauteville, who would earn the nickname Iron Arm by defeating an Arab emir in single combat. He and Harald were fighting on the same side in Sicily in 1038, which is one of those historical coincidences that deserves a pause. The man who had become the founding figure of Norman power in southern Italy and the last great Viking king, killing together on a Mediterranean island 18 years before the year that would define both of their traditions' endings. The Sicilian campaign captured Messina and Syracuse and a string of other positions before stalling, and the saga account of Harald's role in it is coloured by the tradition's characteristic tendency to make its hero the central intelligence of every operation. George Maniacs is reduced to a rival and a fool, and Harald's tactical genius is credited with the victories that the Byzantine sources more accurately attribute to the combined force. What is plausible in the saga account is Harald's leading role in the Varangian contingent, the specific effectiveness of the Varangians in siege operations, and the general picture of a young Norse commander learning the full range of 11th century Mediterranean warfare from the inside. The methods he employed, including the burning of birds in a besieged town story that belongs to the folktale genre, even if it has a kernel of historical reality somewhere in it, and the tactical tricks the sagas attribute to him, represent the saga tradition's understanding of what distinguished Harald from merely brave commanders, a willingness to think obliquely, to solve military problems with cunning when force alone was insufficient. The Bulgarian campaign of 1041 was different in character. Not a foreign conquest, but the suppression of a revolt within the empire itself, against a population that had been under Byzantine rule for a generation, and that rose in response to tax increases and Byzantine cultural imposition. The revolt's leader was Peter Delian, who claimed descent from the Bulgarian royal house, and who organised resistance that required serious military effort to break. Harald's Varangians were part of that effort, and the sources suggest that the fighting in Bulgaria was harder and more sustained than the Sicilian operation. The terrain, and the motivated local resistance providing challenges that a conventional frontal assault could not simply overwhelm. The end of Harald's Byzantine service was coloured by the kind of court politics that the Byzantine imperial system generated in abundance, and that the sagas present in dramatic, simplified terms. The Emperor Michael V, who had come to power through the manipulation of the Empress Zoe, one of the Macedonian dynasty's last representatives, whose claim to the throne rested on her blood rather than on any particular ability, or inclination to rule, attempted in 1042 to exile Zoe, which was the trigger for a popular uprising in Constantinople that overthrew Michael. Harald and his Varangians are said by some sources to have participated in the overthrow, even to have been involved in the blinding off the emperor. The Byzantine punishment for deposition that was preferred to execution because it disqualified the blinded man from rule without making him a martyr. Whether Harald personally blinded Michael V is almost certainly a saga embellishment, but the Varangian Guard's role in the political crisis of 1042 is plausible, given the Guard's structural position as the force physically closest to the imperial person. What is not disputed is that Harald left Constantinople with enormous wealth accumulated over a decade of successful campaigning in which prize money, imperial pay, and the specific Byzantine practice of awarding gold ceremonially at various points in the military cycle had all contributed to a personal fortune that the sagas characterize as the largest any man from the north had ever brought home from a single period of service. He sent regular shipments of this wealth to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping during his service, and when he left Byzantium in 1042, probably not entirely voluntarily, there are hints of court displeasure at the circumstances of his departure. He returned to Kiev to collect it and to complete the business he'd left unfinished there. Yaroslav gave him elisive. Whatever the specific terms of whatever understanding had previously been communicated about Harald's worthiness for the match, those terms were apparently now satisfied. Harald Sigurdsson, who had left Kievan Rus a penniless wounded exile 8 years earlier, returned as a wealthy and famous military commander, married a grand princess of the Rus royal house, and turned his attention to the place he'd been aiming for since before he left. Norway, when Harald returned to it in 1045 or 1046, was under the rule of Magnus the Good, his own nephew, the illegitimate son of the half-brother he had watched die at Stiklestad 15 years earlier. Magnus had come to power in 1035 through a remarkable series of political reversals following Nut the Great's death, which left the North Sea Empire without a strong central authority, and allowed the Norwegian nobility to restore the native dynasty in the person of the young Magnus, who'd been living in Yaroslav's court. He had consolidated his position over the following decade, and had also become King of Denmark in 1042, making him the ruler of the largest Scandinavian political unit since Nut's own empire. Harald's return to Norwegian waters was not a peaceful homecoming. He arrived with wealth and followers and a military reputation, allied himself with Magnus's rival in Denmark, the pretender Svein Estridsson, who had been displaced from the Danish throne by Magnus and who was conducting an ongoing low-level conflict to recover it, and began raiding the Danish coast. The message was clear without needing to be explicitly stated. Magnus could fight on two fronts, against both Harald and Svein simultaneously, or he could negotiate. Magnus chose to negotiate. The arrangement reached in 1046 made Harald co-king of Norway, an equal sharer in the throne, in exchange for Harald sharing half his Byzantine wealth with Magnus. It was the kind of settlement that both parties accepted because each calculated he could outlast the other. Magnus died in October 1047, unexpectedly, at 23 years old, in circumstances that the sources describe vaguely. He had been conducting military operations on the Danish coast and may have been injured in the fighting. One tradition says he fell from his horse while pursuing Svein after a battle. His death without legitimate heirs meant that the succession question resolved automatically. Harald was already king, and the Norwegian throne was now entirely his. Magnus's deathbed decision, or so the sources say, was that Denmark should pass to Svein rather than to Harald, which implies either genuine generosity toward his Danish rival or a calculated attempt to deny Harald what Harald most wanted. Harald had wanted Denmark. The Denmark question would consume most of Harald's reign as King of Norway, and understanding why it consumed him for nearly 20 years requires understanding what he was trying to do and why it kept not working. Harald's conception of what he should be was formed in a specific political tradition, the tradition of the North Sea Empire that Knut the Great had assembled. And that tradition told him that the appropriate scale for a great Norse king was not a single kingdom, but a hegemony over the entire Norse world. Knut had governed England, Denmark and Norway simultaneously, and the fact that Knut's empire had fallen apart after his death did not, in Harald's reading, mean that the ambition was wrong. It meant that Knut's heirs had been inadequate to the task. Harald did not think he was inadequate to anything. The specific tactical picture of the Danish campaigns was one of Norwegian naval superiority and strategic stalemate. Harald could reach Denmark, could raid its coasts, could burn its trading centres, and he burned Haithabu, the great emporium of Jutland, in 1049, which was a significant economic blow to the Danish commercial network. But he could not convert naval raiding into territorial control. Denmark was too large and too densely populated with people loyal to Sweden to be subdued through coastal pressure alone. Every time Harald's fleet burned a town and withdrew, the Danes rebuilt. Every time he won a naval engagement, Sweden's army retreated inland where the Norwegian ships could not follow. The campaigns produced a long series of Norwegian tactical victories and strategic non-achievements. Sweden was also not without military quality. He lost battles. He lost several significant engagements against Harald over the nearly 2 decades of their conflict. But he survived them, maintained the loyalty of his Danish magnates, and kept coming back. The specific quality that Sweden demonstrated across these years was a kind of strategic persistence, a refusal to be finally defeated or finally deterred that wore down the Norwegian willingness to continue even when the immediate military balance favoured Harald. Wars are not won only by winning battles. They are won when one side concludes that the cost of continuing exceeds the value of what continuing might achieve. By 1064, Harald had apparently reached that conclusion, at least about Denmark. England, which was a larger prize and which had a specific succession crisis that made the timing suddenly opportune, was a different calculation. The Peace of 1064 was Harald's acknowledgement that the North Sea Empire was not going to be restored through Danish conquest. It was also, paradoxically, the condition that made the English adventure possible. Having concluded the Danish War, Harald had his ships and his men available for a new enterprise, and the political calendar of 1066 provided the enterprise. Whether this constitutes strategic vision or opportunism is perhaps a distinction without much practical significance. Harald saw an opening and took it, as he had done at every stage of his career since the moment he recovered from his wounds at Stiklestad and started moving. The Denmark question would consume most of Harald's reign as King of Norway, and it is one of the more underappreciated aspects of his life, because the popular narrative tends to skip from his return from Byzantium directly to the English invasion of 1066, leading 2 decades of intensive Scandinavian warfare that shaped the man who arrived in England and the specific conditions that made the invasion seem, from his perspective, a viable option. The conflict with Svein Estridsson, the King of Denmark who'd accepted Magnus's bequest and held the Danish throne through the following 2 decades, was not a single war but a series of campaigns, annual or near-annual raids and counter-raids along the Danish coast, punctuated by periods of negotiation and occasional larger confrontations. Harald was, by most accounts, militarily successful in almost every individual engagement with the Danish forces. He burned Hythabu, the great trading centre of Denmark, in 1049. He raided Zealand, the Danish heartland. He won naval battles and coastal engagements. The specific details of these campaigns are preserved imperfectly in the saga tradition and the contemporary chronicles, but the overall picture is one of a determined and effective military pressure that failed despite its consistency and despite Harald's individual successes to produce the political outcome he wanted. Sweyn was hard to kill, hard to decisively defeat, and hard to dispossess. He kept coming back. He had the loyalty of the Danish magnates who preferred a native Danish king to a Norwegian one regardless of the military balance. He had at various points support from the Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen and from German ecclesiastical and political allies who had their own interest in the Danish political situation. And as the years wore on, the Danish campaigns were consuming Norwegian resources, manpower, ships, the goodwill of the Norwegian farmers and traders who had to provide the warriors and the provisions for campaigns whose strategic justification was becoming harder to sustain. In 1064, Harald and Sweyn concluded a peace that left the borders essentially where they had been when the conflict started, with Sweyn on the Danish throne and Harald on the Norwegian one, no compensation paid, no territory exchanged. After nearly 20 years of fighting, Harald had not conquered Denmark. The peace was not the acknowledgement of defeat exactly. Neither side was destroyed, and both retained their core positions. But it was the acknowledgement that the conquest was not going to happen, that the continuation of the war cost more than it was worth. It was at this point in 1064 or 1065 that the question of England began to come into focus. The succession crisis that would make 1066 one of the most consequential years in English history began with the health and the childlessness of Edward the Confessor. But to understand the crisis properly, you need to understand what England in 1066 actually was, a country and a culture of considerable sophistication that the standard narrative of the Norman conquest too often reduces to a passive object of continental ambition. Anglo-Saxon England in 1066 was not a primitive society about to be rescued from darkness by French civilization. It was one of the most administratively developed states in Western Europe, with a bureaucratic tradition, the royal chancery, the use of written writs to communicate royal commands to local officials, the geld system of national taxation. That was in some respects more sophisticated than anything in contemporary France or the Norman duchy that was about to overrun it. Its legal system, built around the concept of royal law, extended through shire and hundred courts, with professional law speakers and written law codes going back to Alfred the Great in the 9th century, provided a framework of legal order that the Norman conquest would significantly disrupt before eventually rebuilding in modified form. Its church, which had its own rich tradition of scholarship and illuminated manuscript production, was in continuous communication with Rome and with the wider European ecclesiastical world. Its Old English literature, Beowulf, was already centuries old by 1066, but a living tradition of vernacular poetry and prose continued to be produced, was the most developed vernacular literary tradition in Northern Europe. The English society that Harold Godwinson was governing when Harald Hardrada's fleet appeared in the Humber estuary was, in other words, genuinely worth defending. The housecarls who would fight at Stamford Bridge and then at Hastings were not disorganised tribal warriors. They were professional soldiers in the service of an organised state, equipped with the best weapons their age could produce, trained in the shield wall tactics that English heavy infantry had been refining for generations. Harald himself was by any measure an exceptionally capable military and political leader. His management of the border with Wales, his suppression of Welsh resistance in the early 1060s, his handling of the complex political situation of the late Edward's reign, all suggest a man of unusual competence in both military and political domains. The tragedy of 1066 from the English perspective, and there are genuine grounds for calling it a tragedy, since the Norman conquest produced a cultural and demographic disruption whose severity was real even if it eventually generated positive long-term developments, is that the crisis was triggered not by any failure of English institutional capacity, but by the accident of Edward's childlessness and the ambiguity of his expressed preferences for his successor, combined with the specific timing of two simultaneous invasion threats from different directions. England was not defeated in 1066 because it was weak. It was defeated because its king fought two major battles 19 days apart, the second with an army depleted by the first. The sequence began with Harald Hardrada's landing in the Humber. Godwin himself was dead by 1053, but his sons had collectively inherited both his position and his ambitions. The eldest, Harald Godwinson, had become the most powerful man in England after the king, Earl of Wessex, the dominant figure in the royal council, the man through whom most of the practical governance of the kingdom was channeled. He was, by every practical measure except the crown itself, already governing England, and it was generally understood that when Edward died he would be a candidate for the succession. The question was whether he had the political and military position to make that candidacy stick against whatever competition arose. Edward had, in the way that weak kings sometimes do when pressed by powerful subjects, apparently dangled the promise of succession in multiple directions. He was said to have promised it to William of Normandy, the duke who was his cousin and who had received him as a guest at a critical point in his political career. He was said to have sent Harald Godwinson to Normandy in 1064, on what mission is disputed, but the Norman account is that Harald went to confirm the promise of succession, and to have required Harald to swear an oath on sacred relics confirming that promise. Whether Harald made this oath knowingly and broke it, or made it under duress and considered himself unbound, or made it in a context that the Norman interpretation entirely misrepresented, is one of the enduring disputes of medieval English history, because the Norman conquest of 1066 was justified by William partly on the basis of Harold's broken oath, and the English sources present the situation very differently. What is not disputed is that when Edward died on January 5th, 1066, Harald Godwinson was designated as king by the Witenag Mot, the great council of English magnates, and was crowned immediately, the same day that Edward was buried. Harold's claim was strong in practical terms. He had the backing of the most powerful men in England. He had administered the kingdom effectively for years, and he had the military capability to defend his position. But it was politically vulnerable in two important ways. First, the Norman claim was real enough that William could make a credible case for it, and William was a formidable military commander with access to the military resources of northern France. Second, there was an English internal problem, Harold's brother Tostig. Tostig Godwinson had been Earl of Northumbria, the great northern earldom that covered much of what is now Yorkshire and Northumberland, until 1065, when the Northumbrians rose against him in a revolt that expelled him from his earldom and sent him into exile. The revolt's specific grievances were about Tostig's taxation and his failure to protect the northern borders adequately, but the deeper issue was the personality clash between Tostig's style of authority and the specific political culture of the north, which had a long tradition of resisting southern imposed authority. Harold had sided with the rebels rather than his brother, recommending to Edward that Tostig be replaced by Morcar, the rebels' preferred candidate. This was probably the politically correct decision given the balance of forces, but it made Tostig an enemy, and an exiled earl with a grievance and military contacts across northern Europe was exactly the kind of resource that someone else's ambition could use. Harald Hardrada was the man who would use it. The relationship between Harold's claim to the English throne and legal or historical reality is worth examining carefully, because the claim was genuinely thin, and Harold knew it. The chain of argument ran like this. Knut the Great had built a North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark and Norway. After Knut's death, his empire fragmented, but one of the pieces, Denmark, had fallen to Harthacnut. Harthacnut and Magnus the Good, the Norwegian king who was Harold's nephew, had made an agreement that whoever died first without heirs would be succeeded by the other, an arrangement designed to end the Danish-Norwegian conflict by merging the two kingdoms. Harthacnut had died first, but instead of Magnus inheriting England as the agreement specified, the English had crowned Edward the Confessor, Harthacnut's half-brother, through a different mother. Magnus had died without pressing his claim vigorously enough to make it stick. Harold, as Magnus's successor in Norway, considered himself the inheritor of Magnus's claim, 2 steps removed from the original agreement, in a different country from Norway, to a throne that had been held by someone else for 24 years. It was, as historians have consistently noted, not a strong claim. It was the kind of claim that powerful men made when they wanted to do something and needed a justification. Harold probably understood that the legal basis was secondary to the military basis. What mattered was not the argument, but the army, and the army was considerable. He had 300 ships and somewhere between 10 and 15,000 fighting men. He had decades of military experience ranging from Norwegian hill fighting to Byzantine siege operations to steppe cavalry encounters. He had Tostig, who knew England, who had connections in the north of England that might mean local support, and who provided the political relationship to English internal affairs that the Norwegian king lacked. And he had something more subtle, the calculation that 1066 was the best possible moment. England was going to face 2 simultaneous invasion threats, his own from the north and William's from the south. Harold Godwinson could not be in 2 places at once. The English military resources that had to respond to Harold's invasion in the north were English military resources not available to face William in the south. Even if Harold's invasion failed, and he presumably didn't plan for it to fail, it would weaken Harold sufficiently that William's invasion became more viable. The situation in 1066 had a game theory quality to it. The 2 claimants, Harold and William, each benefited from the other's existence, each diluting the English response to both threats simultaneously. Whether Harold thought it through in these terms is impossible to know, but the logic of it was real, and the timing was not accidental. Tostig arrived at Harold's court in 1066, but the specific character of the man who was going to be Harold's co-conspirator, and ultimately his companion in death, deserves more attention than the standard account of 1066 usually gives him, because Tostig Godwinson was not simply a convenient tool for Harold's ambitions, but a genuine historical figure with his own complex motivations and his own claim on the events of that year. Tostig was Harold Godwinson's younger brother, and the relationship between them had been close enough to make the rupture of 1065 genuinely painful for both. They had grown up together, served together, built the family's political dominance together through the years when their father Godwin was the most powerful earl in England, and when Harold was steadily accumulating the power that would eventually make him king. Tostig had been given Northumbria, one of the most important earldoms in England, covering the vast northern territories that were culturally distinct from the south in ways that the Scandinavian settlement had made permanent and had governed it from 1055 with a style that generated specific and eventually fatal resentments. The Northumbrian Revolt of 1065 was, from the rebel leadership's perspective, primarily about Tostig's taxation and his failure to protect the northern borders against Scottish raiding. From Tostig's perspective, it was about the specific difficulty of governing a region whose culture and political traditions differed significantly from the South's, and whose leading families, the Northumbrian Thengs who organised the revolt, had their own interests that conflicted with the extension of southern royal authority through Tostig's earldom. When Harold sided with the rebels, recommending to the dying Edward that Morcar, the rebels' candidate, replace Tostig, Tostig interpreted it as personal betrayal. Harold interpreted it as political realism. Both interpretations were probably accurate. Tostig spent his exile trying to recover his position through any available means. He approached Harald Hardrada because Harold was the most formidable available ally, not because the Norwegian king's claim to England was particularly strong, but because the Norwegian army was real and the opportunity of 1066 was genuinely available. In the exchange at Stamford Bridge, Harold's offer to give Tostig back his earldom if he would desist, the specific pathos of the moment is that Harold was offering exactly what Tostig had been trying to recover, but the terms would have required him to betray Harald Hardrada, and Tostig, whatever his other failures, appears to have been genuinely loyal to the alliance he had made. He asked what Harold would get. He got his answer. He fought and died. Tostig arrived at Harold's court in 1066. The sources differ slightly on when and exactly how the alliance was formed, but the key elements are consistent. Tostig was an exiled English earl who wanted his earldom back and was willing to help anyone who could deliver it. Harold was a Norwegian king with a thin English claim who wanted an English throne and needed local knowledge. The bargain was clear. Tostig would support Harold's claim and provide information and possibly followers in England, and Harold would, upon conquest, restore Tostig's position in the north. It was the kind of arrangement that the political culture of the period understood, and that both parties entered with clear eyes about the limits of the other's trustworthiness. The fleet that Harold assembled in the summer of 1066 was the largest Norwegian naval force in a generation. 300 ships is the number that the chronicles give, and while the exact figure is uncertain, the order of magnitude is not. This was an armada, a genuine fleet designed for the conquest of a kingdom, carrying somewhere in the range of 10 to 15,000 fighting men plus their equipment, horses, provisions, and the support infrastructure that a sustained military campaign in a foreign country required. The ships themselves were the classic Viking longships in their late 11th century form. Long, shallow-drafted, clinker-built, fast under oar and sail, capable of beaching directly on shore rather than requiring harbour facilities, and designed to be both the transport and the supply line for the forces they carried. The crossing of the North Sea and the arrival off the English coast in September 1066 was, by the standards of 11th century navigation, a successful operation. Harold's fleet assembled at Solund in western Norway, crossed to Orkney, which was under Norse lordship and provided both supplies and additional troops, and then proceeded south along the Scottish coast and into the English waters. Tostig met the fleet off the English coast with additional ships recruited in Flanders and with followers who had joined his earlier abortive raids along the English coast in the spring of 1066. The combined force was substantial, and its arrival in the Humber estuary in the second week of September represented a genuine military crisis for Harold Godwinson, who was at the time in the south of England watching the Channel for William's expected crossing. The move up the Humber and then the Ouse was tactically sound. Rivers gave the fleet mobility into the interior, allowed the force to move without depending on coastal conditions, and brought the army to the heart of Northumbria without requiring a difficult coastal landing. Harold's forces disembarked somewhere near Riccal on the Ouse, south of York, and established a base from which to conduct operations. The first military engagement of the English campaign was the Battle of Fulford Gate, but the days between Harold's landing and Fulford deserve attention because they illuminate both the specific military methods of an 11th century invasion and the specific challenges Harold was managing. The fleet's movement up the Humber and then the Ouse was a masterclass in the tactical application of Viking naval mobility, using the river system to penetrate the interior, reaching a position from which York could be threatened, while the fleet remained on the water as both a supply line and a potential line of retreat. The landing near Riccal placed Harold's forces within a day's march of York, while the ships were in a defensible position on the river. The move was not improvised. It reflected a specific understanding of the English northern geography that Tostig's local knowledge had presumably provided, and a specific reading of the English military situation that recognised the northern earls as the immediate threat while the main English army under Harold was in the south watching the Channel. The burning and raiding that accompanied the advance, the fleet hit Scarborough on the way south, and various accounts mention other coastal raids, was not mere opportunism. It served the specific strategic purpose of demonstrating the invaders' presence and capability to the local population, both intimidating potential resistance and drawing out the English response. Harold wanted the northern earls to come to him in the field rather than holding their forces in defended positions, because in the field the Norwegian army's professional quality and numerical superiority would tell decisively. The burning of Scarborough did exactly what it was designed to do. It demonstrated that Harold was serious, and that the northern defence needed to respond. Edwin and Morcar made the response that Harold's strategy invited. They brought their combined forces, probably in the range of 5,000 men, out to meet the Norwegians at Fulford, near the southern approach to York on September 20th. The site of the battle placed the English with marshland on their left and the river on their right, a position that constrained their manoeuvre but also constrained the Norwegians. Harold's force, larger and more professionally composed, pushed the English left into the marsh and then turned to roll up the line from the flank. The battle lasted for several hours by some accounts, and was a comprehensive English defeat. Edwin and Morcar escaped, but their armies were dispersed and the road to York was open. The negotiation with York that followed Fulford was a significant political achievement alongside the military one. York was the largest city in northern England, the centre of the Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England where Danish settlement and Danish law had created a distinct cultural and legal character since the 9th century. Its population included a significant Norse-descended element that might, in some political circumstances, have seen a Norwegian king as less foreign than a West Saxon one. Harold's terms for York, supplies from the city, hostages for good behaviour, an agreement to support his campaign as it moved south, were not punitive. He presented himself as the incoming king, accepting York's submission on terms that the city could live with, rather than as a conqueror looting a conquered city. He was trying to build the political base that a sustained English kingship would require, not merely extracting resources for a raid. The first military engagement of the English campaign was the Battle of Fulford Gate, fought on September 20th, 5 days before Stamford Bridge. The force that came out to meet Harold at Fulford was the northern English army commanded by the two northern earls. Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia, brothers-in-law to King Harold, men whose position in the north gave them both the authority and the obligation to respond to the Norwegian invasion. They had perhaps 5,000 men. Harold had more. The battle was a significant English defeat. The English army was pushed into the marshy ground near the river and took heavy casualties, with Edwin and Morcar escaping, but their forces dispersed. York submitted to Harold within days of the battle, the northern capital acknowledging Norwegian control and agreeing to supply the invading army. This was the moment of Harold's maximum success. He had crossed the North Sea, landed his army, won a significant battle, and taken the principal city of northern England in less than a fortnight. The representatives of York had agreed to give hostages, the standard medieval mechanism for securing compliance, and were to deliver them at Stamford Bridge, a village on the River Derwent east of York, on September 25th. Harold's army moved towards Stamford Bridge in good spirits, confident enough in the security of their position that many had left their heavy armour behind at Rickle with the fleet. It was a hot day. Harold Godwinson was in London when the news of Fulford reached him. The speed of his response was remarkable, and reflects both his military quality and his understanding of what was at stake. He gathered his forces, the housecarls, the professional soldiers who formed the core of his army, and as many of the fyrd, the English militia, as he could assemble on short notice, and marched north at a pace that the chronicles present as something between extraordinary and implausible. London to York is roughly 200 miles. Harold covered it in approximately 9 days, arriving at York on September 24th and learning there that Harold's army was at Stamford Bridge 7 miles to the east, expecting the hostage delivery and not expecting an English army. The march had been brutal for the men who made it. 200 miles in 9 days means roughly 22 miles a day, in September, carrying weapons and equipment, some of them on horseback but many on foot, arriving at a destination where they were immediately expected to fight. The willingness of Harold's army to do this, to march at that pace, and then go into battle without rest, is a measure of both Harold's personal authority as a commander and the specific fighting spirit of the professional huscarl class, men who had made military service their entire career and who understood what the situation required. Harold arrived at Stamford Bridge at dawn on September 25th, catching the Norwegian army entirely by surprise. The famous story of the lone Norwegian warrior who held the bridge while Harold's men scrambled to form up is one of the most vivid anecdotes in the sources. A single axeman holding the narrow bridge against the English advance, long enough to be killed from below by an Englishman in a barrel or a boat in the water, a detail that has the slightly theatrical quality of things that got better in the telling, but whose essence, the bridge held briefly by one man, may have happened. Whether it did or not, the basic situation is clear. The Norwegian army was caught unprepared, in the heat, without the armour that had been left at Rickle. Harald Hardrada responded with the reflexive aggressiveness of a man who had spent 50 years fighting. He formed his men up in a circular defensive formation rather than the traditional shield wall, which was appropriate for a force that was encircled by a larger army. The circular formation allowed defence in all directions and bought time for his force to establish cohesion under the pressure of the attack. He rode around the formation on his horse, directing his men, his height making him visible across the battle. An early English attack pushed the Norwegian line back, and Harold led a counter-attack that, according to the sources, nearly turned the battle, the Norwegians driving the English back before the momentum shifted again. Then Harold was hit by an arrow in the throat. The sources are specific about this. An arrow in the throat. A wound that killed him quickly. He was the Thunderbolt of the North, the last man in the north who had campaigned from Constantinople to Yorkshire, and he died from a single arrow shot during a confused infantry battle by a man whose name nobody recorded. Tostig took command of what remained after Harald fell and fought on until he too was killed. The Norwegian army, deprived of both its leaders in the space of one engagement, collapsed. The slaughter was severe enough that the survivors who fled back to Rickal and the fleet, Harald's son Olaf among them, were given terms and allowed to leave with the 24 ships it took to carry home what remained of the force that had arrived in 300. These survivors of the largest Viking army sent against England were squeezed into less than a tenth of the fleet they had come in. Harald Godwinson offered quarter to Olaf and to the Earl of Orkney, who had also survived, on the condition that they leave and never return. Olaf swore it and kept the oath. He returned to Norway and ruled it well, earning the epithet Olaf the Peaceful, Kira, and presiding over a Norway that was, after his father's death, not going to be sending any more armies south. The age of the Viking invasions of England was over. Harald Godwinson did not linger in the north. But what happened at Stamford Bridge in the hours after Harald's death deserves more space than the summary treatment it usually receives, because the scale of the Norse disaster was extreme even by the standards of the 11th century battle casualties, and the personal human dimension of it, the survivors, the dead, the terms of the withdrawal, gives the engagement a texture that bare military narrative misses. The fighting after Harald fell was sustained by men who knew they were losing, but who had nowhere safe to fall back to. The fleet at Rissial was miles away. The English army surrounded them, and the Norse military tradition held that to run from a battle was the worst possible death, worse than the death on the field itself. So they fought on, the men who had come from Norway with ambitions for England, until enough of them were dead that the remainder could not effectively resist. Tostig fought until he was killed, which, given the circumstances, was perhaps the best outcome he could have achieved. An exiled English earl who'd led a foreign invasion against his own country would not have found much in the way of welcome from the victorious Harald, whose offer of 7 feet of earth to Harald Hardrada's associates applied implicitly to the man who had engineered the invasion. The survivors who made it back to Rickal were, by the Chronicle's account, a small fraction of the force that had arrived. The Norse sources say that of the 300 ships that had come to England, 24 were sufficient to carry home everyone who remained. The arithmetic is brutal. If each ship carried 30 to 50 men, the remaining force was perhaps 700 to some 200 men, out of an original complement of 10 to 15,000. The casualty rate at Stamford Bridge and at Fulford Gate combined was somewhere between 80 and 90% of the invading force, making it one of the most complete military defeats in the saga of Norse England. Harald's son Olaf, who had been left at Rickal with the fleet rather than advancing to Stamford Bridge, was among the survivors. Harald Godwinson met with him before the fleet departed and reportedly treated him with a specific combination of magnanimity and pragmatism that the best Anglo-Saxon kings displayed toward defeated enemies. Olaf was given leave to depart with the remnant of his force, on his sworn oath that he and his men would not return as enemies to England. Olaf swore it on the relics that Norse warriors carried for exactly this purpose. The oath was binding in the specific religious and cultural framework of the 11th century Norse world, and kept it. He returned to Norway and became its king, and the peaceful name he earned was not merely ironic. He had seen what his father's ambition had cost, and he governed differently. Harald Godwinson did not linger in the north. He learned, within days of the battle, that William's fleet had crossed the Channel and landed in Sussex on September 28th. The decision he faced, To rest his men in the north and move south deliberately, or to march immediately and catch William before he could consolidate, is one of the most analysed decisions in English military history, and the analysis consistently notes that he made it quickly and fatally. He marched south. His army covered the ground to Hastings in roughly the same time it had covered the ground from London to York, arriving after a march that left even the professional housecarls depleted. On October 14th, 19 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold's army met William's at Senlac Hill near Hastings, and Harold was killed, and England became Norman. The connection between Harald Hardrada and William's victory at Hastings is direct, and has been made by historians since the Middle Ages. Had Harold not invaded in the north, Harold Godwinson would not have fought at Stamford Bridge. His army would not have been depleted by the march and the battle, and the outcome at Hastings might have been different. Whether Harold could have defeated William's Normans in the condition his army was in before Stamford Bridge is a genuine counterfactual that cannot be answered certainly, but the question is worth taking seriously. The Norman army at Hastings was formidable. Professional cavalry, disciplined archers, a commander of extraordinary tactical quality. Harold's housecarls were exceptional infantry. The battle was closely fought and lasted all day, which suggests the margin of English defeat was not so large that it was inevitable regardless of the army's condition. Harald Hardrada's invasion did not conquer England. It may have made William's conquest possible. The Viking Age did not end at a single moment, and the claim that Stamford Bridge is its closing date is a historical convenience rather than a literal truth. There were still Norsemen raiding, trading, settling and ruling across the North Atlantic world for generations after 1066. But the claim has genuine substance as a marker of the end of something specific, the era of large-scale Viking expeditions against England, the era in which Norse kings could seriously contemplate the conquest of the richest kingdom in the West. That era did end at Stamford Bridge, and it ended with the man who embodied it most completely. Harald Hardrada was not the greatest king Norway ever produced. He was not the most successful Viking military leader. He never conquered Denmark despite nearly 20 years of trying, and he died on a foreign shore attempting a conquest that most historians think was always unlikely to succeed, even in more favourable circumstances. His career was magnificent in its scope, and ultimately unsuccessful in its ultimate ambitions. But he was, in the specific sense that the 11th-century Norse world would have understood, the most complete Viking the age produced in its final generation. Exile, mercenary, commander, king, adventurer, poet. The sagas record him composing verse in the moments before his death, which may be invention but is characteristically Viking in its conceit. And finally, invader of England at an age when most men who had survived what he had survived would have been content to sit by a fire and watch their grandsons. He was the last man to attempt what his predecessors had achieved. Nut had conquered England in 1016, a real conquest, thorough and lasting, followed by 17 years of competent governance. Harold tried to repeat it in 1066 and failed. The difference was not Harold's quality as a warrior or a commander, which was very high. The difference was that England in 1066 was a different country from England in 1016, more politically coherent, with a stronger central military institution in the housecarls and the system of rapid military mobilization that Harold had demonstrated, with a king who was himself an extraordinary military leader. Harold faced a better opponent in a better prepared country, and was caught on a bad day without his armour, and an arrow found his throat. The sagas record a pre-battle exchange that has become one of the most famous in the literature of 1066, and whether it happened exactly as described or not, It captures the essential dynamic with the compact clarity that good legend achieves. Before the battle, Harald Godwinson rode forward under truce to offer terms to the Norwegian force. He offered Tostig his earldom back if he would desist. Tostig asked what Harald Hardrada would receive. Harald answered, 7 feet of English earth, or perhaps a little more since he is taller than other men. Harald reportedly received this answer with equanimity. He asked who had made the offer. He was told it was Harald Godwinson himself. He said, "He is small, but he sat well in his stirrups." The exchange is probably too good to be entirely true. It is certainly true in spirit. 2 formidable men who understood each other, knowing that what was coming could not be avoided, finding in the moment before it the specific Norse composure toward death that both of their traditions had spent centuries trying to produce. 7 feet of English earth is what Harald received. They buried him at Stamford Bridge, and his bones were brought back to Norway after a time to be interred in Trondheim. The place in Yorkshire where he fell is quiet now. The River Derwent runs through it. There is a pub in the village called the Swordsman. A plaque marks the battlefield. The September heat of 1066 is long gone. The arrow has been in the ground for nearly 1,000 years. The world that existed after Harald was different from the world before him, but not only in the way that the Norman conquest made it different. It was different because the last man who would try to maintain the Norse claim on England had tried and failed, and the failure was final. No Norwegian king after Olaf the Peaceful would send a fleet south to take the English throne. The commercial and cultural connections between Scandinavia and England continued. They were too deeply embedded in trade and kinship and language to evaporate overnight. But the military relationship, the relationship of potential conquest, was over. The Varangian Guard continued for another century and more after Harald left it. It would eventually absorb the Anglo-Saxons who fled England after the Norman conquest, men who had fought at Hastings and who found in Byzantine service both employment and a continuation of the fighting life that the Norman domination of England had closed off to them. The Guard's Anglo-Saxon phase is one of the stranger episodes in the story of 1066's aftermath. The men Harald Godwinson lost to William ended up in the same military institution that Harald Hardrada had commanded 30 years before, serving the same emperor's successors in the same city with the same axes. History rarely produces irony so complete. Norway itself changed after Harald. But it is worth pausing on what Harald himself had built in Norway during his reign, because the Norway he left behind was meaningfully different from the Norway he had found when he returned from Byzantium, and the difference was his deliberate work. Harald's domestic administration of Norway is consistently overshadowed by his military adventures, but the coin economy he introduced, the territorial consolidation he forced on the Norwegian chieftains, who had previously maintained semi-autonomous power in their regions, and the development of Trondheim as a genuine urban centre, with the cathedral dedicated to St. Olaf at its heart, were achievements that outlasted him. The introduction of irregular coinage, silver coins minted to a consistent standard and circulated as a medium of exchange, was a significant step in the development of Norway's commercial economy, converting transactions that had previously been conducted in weighed silver and in commodity trade into something more reliably monetized. It was in a small way the lesson of Byzantium applied to the north. A centralized state required a standardized currency and the administrative infrastructure to maintain it. The consolidation of Norwegian territorial control was conducted with methods that his epithet accurately described. Harald Hardrada, hard ruler, did not govern through consensus in the Norse traditional mode, where the king's authority was regularly negotiated with the regional chieftains through the Thing system. He ruled by imposing his will on men who had previously considered themselves more nearly his equals, and the sources, record executions and confiscations, and the ruthless suppression of aristocratic resistance that suggest a king who was using his Byzantine experience of autocratic authority rather than his Norse inheritance of consultative kingship. He was creating something new, a more centralized, more personally dominant form of Norwegian royal authority, and the men it displaced were not happy about it. But it worked, in the sense that when he left for England in 1066, Norway was a more unified and more effectively governed country than the fragmented principalities he'd returned to in 1045. The Norway he left behind, and the son who inherited it, would develop these foundations into the medieval Norwegian kingdom that became one of the stable Christian monarchies of the north, a Norway that no longer sent raiding fleets against England, that traded with the Hanseatic cities and maintained diplomatic relations with the papacy and participated in the Crusades, that built the stave churches whose wooden beauty still stands in the Norwegian countryside. Harald Hardrada was the last king of the old mould. Olaf was the first of the new one. The transition happened in a single generation, at the bridge on the Derwent in September of 1066. Norway itself changed after Harald. His son Olaf was called the Peaceful, not as an irony but as a genuine description. His reign was genuinely peaceful by the standards his father had established, and the change in tone was partly temperament, and partly the exhaustion of a country that had been at war almost continuously for decades. The coin economy and the administrative institutions that Harald had developed during his reign gave Olaf's peaceful reign a stable foundation to build on. Norway in the late 11th century was becoming a medieval European kingdom rather than a Viking raiding culture, settling into the institutional patterns, the church, the nobility, the towns, the regular administration, that the rest of Christian Europe had been developing for generations. Harald had fought his way across 3 continents in an older mould. His successor presided over the transition to a newer one. The sagas that preserve Harald's story were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, 200 years after his death. But the tradition they drew on was living and specific in ways that the gap in time might suggest it could not be. Iceland in the 13th century was a small, literate, historically minded society whose educated class had a strong sense of its Norse identity and its connection to the mainland Scandinavian history from which the island's population was descended. The preservation of Harald's memory was not a matter of vague legend but of specific genealogical and historical record. Icelandic families could trace their descent from specific Norwegian chieftains who had been alive in Harald's time, and the desire to know what those ancestors had done, what world they had inhabited, was a genuine cultural motivation for the preservation and transmission of specific historical knowledge. Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Heimskringla around 1230, was himself a significant political figure in the Iceland of his day, a chieftain of considerable wealth and influence, twice law speaker of the Althing, and eventually killed in a political dispute that reflected the instability of 13th century Icelandic society. He was also a genuine scholar, working from earlier written sources, from skaldic verse that he cited and analysed, and from oral traditions that he evaluated critically rather than accepting wholesale. His Harald's Saga Sigurdarsonar is the fullest account of Harald's life that survives, and its quality is suggested by how much of it has been confirmed by non-Scandinavian sources. The Byzantine chronicle evidence for the Varangian Guard's campaigns, the chronicles of the Battle of Stamford Bridge in English and Norman sources, the general framework of 11th-century Scandinavian politics that can be triangulated from multiple independent sources. Snorri made mistakes, and his presentation of Harald is coloured by the saga tradition's characteristic hero enhancement. But the core of what he tells us about Harald's career is broadly reliable. What makes Snorri's account of Harald particularly valuable is the preservation of skaldic verse composed during Harald's lifetime, which he quotes and analyses in the text. Several of Harald's own compositions survive in this way, short poems composed at specific moments in his career, in the tight, demanding form of the Old Norse skaldic verse tradition. A poem Harald apparently composed on the night before Stamford Bridge, looking at the situation with clear eyes and composing 12 stanzas before his death the following morning, is the saga's way of showing the reader what kind of man faced what was coming, not without awareness of the possibility of defeat, but choosing the poem over the fear. Whether the specific verse attributed to him is authentically his or a later composition placed in his mouth, it captures the tradition's understanding of Harald, a man who met every situation with the specific form of Norse equanimity that expressed itself in composed verse rather than in panic or despair. Snorri was writing in a world that no longer had Vikings in the old sense. The age he was describing was as remote from his readers as the First World War is from ours, and he was doing for his contemporaries what we're doing tonight, recovering a world that had passed and presenting it whole, with all its violence and ambition and extraordinary human specificity, to people who needed to understand where they had come from. The night is settling around you now, and the long story of Harald Hardrada has reached its proper ending, not in the history books where he gets a paragraph or a chapter, but here where he gets the full span of his life across all the territories it covered and all the decades it consumed. A wounded boy in a Norwegian forest in 1030, a soldier in the rivers of Russia, a mercenary commander in the service of emperors on 3 continents in a decade of uninterrupted campaigning, a king who fought nearly 20 years to take a throne and never got it, a man of 50 who looked at the succession crisis of a distant kingdom and saw one more chance and took it. The arrow that killed him at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, ended a life of extraordinary range and ultimately inconclusive ambition. He never conquered Denmark. He never conquered England. He did not, in the end, restore anything like the North Sea Empire of Canute. What he did was live, fully and dangerously, and with a completeness of engagement with his world that very few human beings in any era manage, from the battle where his brother died to the battle where he died himself, always moving, always fighting, always reaching for the next thing that was just over the next horizon. The world remembered him as the last great Viking. The world may not have been wrong about that, though it is the kind of label that requires some care. He was the last man to make the Viking attempt at its fullest scale, the personal leadership of a great fleet across the sea to take by force what he believed was his. After him, that particular form of political life was over. The age it belonged to was over. What came after was different, in ways that have made the world we live in, but what came before was what Harald Hardrada was, and what he was worth the telling. The River Derwent is running tonight at Stamford Bridge, dark and quiet. The plaque on the battlefield gives a date. The pub is called the Swordsman, somewhere in Trondheim, in ground that has been built over and rebuilt many times in the 1,000 years since he was put there. The bones of the last great Viking king are mixed into the Norwegian earth he left as a boy and came home to as a memory. Rest easy.